My mother's voice was shaking on the phone, and for one strange, dizzying second, I thought someone had died. "Ethan, honey, we need you," she said. "The bank is going to take the house. We need $40,000 by Friday." I stood in my kitchen. The phone pressed so hard against my ear it hurt, and I laughed. Not because it was funny, because there was nothing else my body knew how to do. $40,000 was almost exactly the amount they had taken from me 11 years earlier. The number wasn't a coincidence. Life doesn't usually hand you irony that clean, but that night, it did. It handed it to me wrapped in my mother's trembling voice, like she expected me to be grateful for the chance to save them. "You still there?" she asked when my silence stretched too long. I was there. I just wasn't the same person who used to answer that question with, "Yes, Mom, I'm here, what do you need?" the way I had for 26 years. I was 31 years old, standing in a kitchen I'd paid for myself, and my mother was asking me to hand over the exact amount of money that had once been mine, taken without asking, and given to my brother instead. If you've ever been the child who had to earn what your sibling was simply given, you already know the specific kind of quiet that filled that kitchen. It isn't peaceful. It's the quiet right before you decide who you're going to be. Let me back up. Let me explain how we got here, because this story didn't start with a phone call. It started 16 years ago, in a house with yellow siding on Maple Court, with a boy who thought his family loved him enough to keep their word. I grew up in Ashland County, a place where the winters came early and stayed too long, in a house my father built, additions onto every few years like he was trying to keep up with a family that never stopped needing more room. There were 4 of us. My father, Robert, a man who worked at the same manufacturing plant for 26 years and wore his tiredness like a second skin. My mother, Diane, who taught 2nd grade and came home every day smelling like chalk dust and the inside of a crayon box. My older brother, Caleb, 3 years ahead of me in everything: school, height, trouble, and me. Caleb was the kind of golden that doesn't require explanation. He was born 6 weeks premature, and my mother told that story so many times growing up that I could recite it in my sleep. The tiny lungs, the incubator, the doctor who said the first 48 hours would decide everything. I think some part of my mother never stopped being that terrified young woman in the hospital hallway, and some part of her never stopped treating Caleb like he was still fighting for his life. I was born 3 years later, uneventfully, on a Tuesday afternoon with no drama at all. My father used to joke that I came into the world like I was already trying not to be a bother. He meant it as a compliment. I didn't understand until much later how much that sentence would come to define me. Growing up, the differences weren't loud. That's the part people don't expect when they hear stories like mine. Nobody screamed, "We love him more." It was quieter than that. It was in the way my mother sat through every one of Caleb's basketball games, rain or shine, keeping score in a little notebook, while she missed 2 of my 3 science fairs because something came up. It was in the way my father's face changed when Caleb walked into a room, this small brightening like a porch light clicking on. That never quite happened for me the same way. I want to be fair here because this isn't a story about villains. My parents were not cruel people. They were tired people, stretched people, people doing their best with wounds of their own that I wouldn't understand until I was much older. My father grew up with a dad who barely spoke to him. My mother grew up the middle child of 5, invisible in her own house. They were both trying, in their broken, human ways, to be better than what they came from. They just didn't realize that in trying to make sure Caleb never felt what they'd felt, they'd built the exact same shape of hurt and handed it to me instead. By the time I was 14, I understood something without anyone saying it out loud. In our family, love was a resource, and it wasn't distributed evenly. Caleb got the benefit of the doubt. I got the responsibility. When Caleb failed a class, it was because the teacher didn't understand him. When I failed a class, which happened exactly once, 10th grade geometry, it was because I wasn't trying hard enough. When Caleb got in a fight junior year and broke another boy's nose, My father drove 40 minutes to talk to the school, bored, and came home saying the other kid probably deserved it. When I got detention for talking back to a substitute teacher who'd insulted a classmate with a stutter, my mother didn't speak to me for 2 days. I'm not telling you this to make you angry on my behalf. I'm telling you this because you need to understand the ground this all grew out of. What happened with the money wasn't a single decision. It was the final, loudest note in a song that had been playing quietly for years. The college fund started when I was 7 years old. My grandmother, my mother's mother, a woman named Ruth, who smelled like ivory soap and peppermint, and who was, without question, the person who loved me the most uncomplicatedly in my entire childhood, had passed away and left a small inheritance to be split between her grandchildren. My parents took my portion, $11,000, and put it into an account they told me, repeatedly over the years, was for your college, Ethan. Untouchable. They said the same thing about Caleb's portion. His account got contributions added to it too. Birthday money, tax refunds some years, a portion of my father's overtime pay when the plant offered a bonus program in 2009. Mine grew the same way. Slower because my parents made less those years, but it grew. By the time I turned 18, that account held just over $41,000. I know the exact number because I checked it myself at the public library on a computer with a cracked monitor 3 weeks before my high school graduation, because I'd finally been accepted to the state university 2 hours from home, into a business program I had worked 4 years to get into, and I needed to know how much I had to work with. The account had $612 in it. I remember sitting in that library chair for what felt like 20 minutes, just staring at the screen, refreshing the page like the number might fix itself if I gave it enough chances. The librarian, an older woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, asked me if I was all right. I don't remember what I told her. I remember my hands were cold. Even though it was May and the library didn't have air conditioning yet, I drove home that day going the speed limit exactly, both hands on the wheel, the way you drive when you're trying very hard not to feel anything. Because if you let one feeling in, they'll all come flooding through the crack behind it. My mother was in the kitchen when I got home, braiding chicken cutlets for dinner, and I remember the sound the oil made when it hit the pan. This low hiss that seemed too calm for the conversation I was about to start. "Where's my college money?" I said. Not a question. I didn't have the emotional bandwidth left for a question mark. She didn't turn around right away. That's the detail I remember most. 16 years later, she kept her back to me, kept moving the cutlets around in the pan with a fork. And there was a stretch of silence long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming, the clock on the wall ticking, my own heartbeat in my ears. "Sit down, Ethan," she finally said. "I don't want to sit down. I want to know where $40,000 went." She turned around then, and her face had that particular kind of guilt that tries to disguise itself as patience. "Your brother needed it for the dealership opportunity. You remember, Danny Whitfield's father." I did remember. Caleb, 21 at the time, 3 semesters into a community college program he wasn't finishing, had gotten excited about a chance to buy into a small used car lot on Route 9 with a family friend. It was going to be his big break. My father had talked about it at dinner for weeks, like Caleb had been accepted into Harvard. "You gave him my money," I said. I wasn't yelling. I want you to understand that. I was very quiet because I was doing math in my head, trying to figure out if there was some version of this sentence that didn't mean what it obviously meant. "We were going to put it back," my mother said. "Your father was going to put it back before you needed it. The dealership was supposed to, Ethan. It was supposed to work. Was supposed to. It didn't work out the way we hoped." I asked her, and my voice cracked on the question in a way that embarrasses me even now, whether they had touched Caleb's account too. Whether his $41,000 had gone into that dealership right alongside mine. She didn't answer. She turned back to the stove. And in the not answering, I got the only answer I needed. Silence makes liars keep talking, but it makes the honest ones go quiet, because the honest ones know that silence is the only truthful thing left to offer. My father came home an hour later to find me sitting at the kitchen table with my acceptance letter to state in front of me like some kind of eviction notice, and my mother standing at the counter with her arms crossed, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. I won't pretend I remember every word of the conversation that followed, because grief has a way of editing memory, cutting some scenes entirely and looping others on repeat. But I remember my father's face. I remember he didn't apologize. Not really. What he said instead was, "You're the strong one. Ethan, you've always figured things out. Caleb needs more help than you do." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I've sat with it for 16 years. You've always figured things out. As if my competence was the reason I deserved less. As if the ability to survive without support was a punishment I earned by surviving. That's the cruelest kind of unfairness. I think not the kind that comes from hatred, but the kind that comes from a backhanded, twisted version of respect. My parents didn't take my money because they thought I was worthless. They took it because they thought I was strong enough not to need it. And somehow that hurt more. I didn't scream that night. I didn't throw anything, didn't slam a door dramatically. None of the things you'd expect from a scene like this in a movie. I just sat there and something in me went very quiet and very cold. And I remember thinking with a strange, calm clarity, I am going to remember exactly how this feels. I want to speak to you directly for a moment. Because if you've ever been the child who had to earn what your sibling was simply given, I think you already know this feeling in your bones, and I don't need to explain it any further. You know what it's like to be loved conditionally, on the condition that you never ask for too much. You know what it's like to be told you're strong as a way of excusing the fact that no one is going to help carry your weight. If that's you, I want you to know, before this story goes any further, that what happened to you was not fair, and it was not your fault, and being strong should never have been the reason you got less. I started that fall semester at State with $612, a duffel bag of clothes, and a level of quiet fury that I didn't have a name for yet. I worked 2 jobs my freshman year, overnight stocking at a grocery store on the edge of campus, and weekend shifts at a coffee shop downtown where I learned to steam milk with my eyes half closed from exhaustion. I took out loans I would spend the next decade paying off. I ate a lot of instant ramen and a lot of free samples at Costco on the weekends. I drove home, which that first year wasn't often. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about a betrayal like that: it doesn't just cost you money. It costs you closeness. I stopped coming home for the little things. Stopped calling just to talk. My mother would text me links to job postings near campus, like she was trying to be helpful, and I would read them and feel this dull ache, because I understood, even then, that she still didn't fully grasp what she'd taken from me. She thought the wound was about money. It was never just about money. Caleb's dealership folded within 14 months. I found out through a mutual cousin on Facebook, not through my parents, which tells you something about where I stood in the family information chain by then. The car lot on Route 9 became briefly a mattress outlet, and then sat empty for almost 2 years after that. A faded grand opening banner still hanging crooked in the window the last time I drove past it. Nobody in my family ever brought up where that $41,000 had actually gone. It just evaporated into the category of things we didn't discuss, along with my father's drinking during my middle school years and the year my mother spent sleeping in the guest room. Every family has that category. Ours was just especially full. I graduated in 4 years, which felt like a small miracle given the hours I was working. With a degree in finance and GPA I was quietly proud of, and a level of exhaustion that took almost a year to fully recover from. My parents came to graduation. My mother cried and hugged me for a long time in the parking lot afterward and told me she was proud of me, and I let her because some part of me still wanted that hug to mean something. My father shook my hand, actually shook my hand, like I was a coworker, and said, "Good job, kid. Knew you'd figure it out. Knew you'd figure it out." I got in my car after that ceremony, sat in the driver's seat for a long time before I turned the key, and I thought about all the ways that sentence was both a compliment and an indictment. They knew I'd figure it out. That's exactly why they never worried about me. That's exactly why it was safe to take what was mine and give it to the one they were afraid wouldn't figure it out on his own. I moved to the city after graduation, 90 minutes from Ashland County. Close enough to visit, far enough to breathe. I got an entry-level position at a regional accounting firm, the kind of unglamorous job that doesn't make for an exciting story but makes for a stable one. And I worked. God, I worked. I took every certification course I could afford, worked weekends when the firm needed extra hands during tax season, said yes to every unpaid extra hour because I understood something early that a lot of people don't understand until much later. Nobody was going to hand me anything. If I wanted a life that felt solid under my feet, I was going to have to build every inch of the foundation myself. I want to pause here and tell you something that took me years to understand, something I think matters more than the betrayal itself. The version of me that walked out of that kitchen at 18 years old could have gone two ways. I could have let that unfairness harden into something bitter and consuming. Could have spent my 20s drowning in resentment, letting it poison every relationship, every job, every quiet moment. Some people do. I don't blame them for it. That kind of wound has every right to calcify into anger. But somewhere in that first brutal year of college, stocking shelves at 2 a.m, with my hands cracked from the cold of the dairy cooler, I made a decision, mostly without realizing I was making it. I decided that my life was not going to be a rebuttal to my parents. I wasn't building anything to prove them wrong. I was building it because I deserved a life that was mine, entirely mine, untouched by anyone else's hands. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it does. Revenge burns fast and leaves you with ashes. Building something for yourself, quietly, patiently, year after year, that's the kind of fire that actually keeps you warm. Caleb, meanwhile, drifted. After the dealership failed, he bounced through jobs, a stint selling insurance, a few months managing a gym that closed during a recession scare, a longer run doing sales for a home security company, where he actually did well for a couple of years, well enough that my parents started talking about him like the crisis of his early 20s had just been a rough patch, a chapter, not a pattern. I want to be fair to Caleb here too, because he is not the villain of this story any more than my parents are. Caleb was handed advantages he didn't ask for and never quite learned how to want anything badly enough to fight for it himself, because he never had to. That's its own kind of damage. I used to be jealous of it. By my late 20s, I mostly just felt sorry for him, the way you feel sorry for someone who was given a boat and never taught how to sail it, and is now surprised to find himself adrift. We weren't close, Caleb and I, not the way brothers in movies are close. But we weren't enemies either. There were birthdays where he'd send a text, a Christmas or two where we sat next to each other at my parents' table and talked about nothing in particular. Football, a mutual friend's wedding, whether the diner on Route 9 still made the good pie. There was an undercurrent between us that neither of us named out loud, a kind of mutual, unspoken understanding that our parents had put us in a strange competition neither of us had agreed to enter, and that neither of us had won, not really. He got the money. I got the freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. I'm not sure, looking back, which one of us got the better deal. 6 years passed like that. I built a career. I got promoted, twice, then moved to a slightly larger firm, downtown where I finally started making real money. Not rich by any stretch, but the kind of steady that let me stop checking my bank balance every single morning like it might have betrayed me overnight. I bought a small townhouse in my late 20s, the first thing I had ever owned outright. And I remember standing in the empty living room the day I got the keys, running my hand along a wall that belonged to no one but me, and crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry since that night in the kitchen with the chicken cutlets. I dated a woman named Priya for almost 3 years during that stretch, a nurse I met through a mutual friend, and she was the first person outside my own head I ever told the whole story to. The account, the $612, the sentence about being the strong one. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, And then she said something I've never forgotten. It sounds like they loved you the way you love a tool you trust, not the way you love something fragile that needs protecting. I didn't have a response to that. I still don't, really. It was just true. Priya and I eventually ended, not from any explosive fight, but from a slow drifting apart. The kind of ending that comes when two people want slightly different futures and are honest enough to admit it before resentment builds. We stayed friendly. I mention her only because she's the reason I finally, at 29, sat down and had one real conversation with my mother about what had happened all those years ago. It was a Sunday in October, the kind of crisp fall afternoon that makes you nostalgic for a childhood you didn't quite have. I drove out to Ashland County for my father's 60th birthday, more out of obligation than desire, and afterward, when the guests had left and my father had fallen asleep in his recliner in front of a football game, my mother and I ended up alone at the kitchen table. The same house, older now, the linoleum a little more worn. "Can I ask you something?" I said, "and can you actually answer me this time?" She looked up from the coffee she was stirring, and something in her face told me she knew exactly what was coming. Mothers usually do. "Did you ever plan to pay it back?" I asked. "The money. Did you and Dad ever actually intend to replace it, or did you just say that to make yourselves feel better?" She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the refrigerator hummed, and somewhere down the hall, my father snored through the television noise, and I found myself thinking about that same silence 11 years earlier, and how it had taught me to expect nothing. "I think we meant to," she finally said. "In the beginning, your father really believed the dealership would work, and we thought, we'd put it back before you even needed it. And then it didn't work, and Caleb was struggling, and we told ourselves you were fine. You were always fine, Ethan. You never once asked us for help. Not once, your whole life. So we told ourselves it wasn't as bad as it would have been if you'd needed it. I didn't ask because I didn't think I was allowed to," I said. "There's a difference between not needing help and not knowing you're allowed to want it." My mother's eyes filled, and she didn't try to hide it, which was new for her. "I know that now," she said. "I don't know if I knew it then." It wasn't an apology, not really. Not the kind I'd imagined giving speeches about in my head for a decade. It was something smaller and more honest than that, an admission, offered without excuse, that they had made a calculation about which of their sons could bear the weight of being disappointed, and had chosen me because I'd never once shown them what it looked like when I broke. I left that afternoon without resolution exactly, but with something looser in my chest than I'd carried in for years. Not forgiveness, not yet. Just the first crack of daylight into a room that had been shut for a long time. If I'd known what was coming 2 years later, I might have appreciated that afternoon more. I might have understood it was the calm before something much harder. The call about the house came on a Tuesday in March, almost exactly 2 years after that conversation at the kitchen table. I was 31. I had by then made senior associate at my firm, a title that came with a salary that would have made 18-year-old me weep with relief. I had savings. I had, for the first time in my adult life, something that felt like security. My mother's voice on the phone that night had a particular texture to it, thin, stretched, the voice of someone who has cried recently and is trying very hard not to start again. She told me about the house, about how, 2 years earlier, Caleb had come to them with an idea for a restaurant, a barbecue place out on the highway, and how my father, in what I can only describe as an act of desperate, misguided love, had taken out a second mortgage to help him start it. $40,000, almost to the number. The restaurant had done all right for the first year, well enough that my parents let themselves believe in it, and then a chain restaurant opened 2 exits down the highway, and the customers thinned. And Caleb had made some decisions with the remaining capital that my mother described carefully as not smart. And by the time anyone admitted the trouble out loud, the restaurant was gone, and so was the money. And the second mortgage payment had ballooned past what my parents could manage on a manufacturing pension and a part-time substitute teaching income. "We're going to lose the house, Ethan," she said. "The bank sent a notice. We have until Friday to bring the account current or they start foreclosure. We need $40,000. I stood in my kitchen, the one I'd bought with money I'd earned with my own 2 hands after climbing out of a hole they'd put me in, and I felt the floor tilt slightly under me. The particular vertigo of history, repeating itself in a shape too precise to be coincidence. 40,000, I repeated. "We wouldn't ask if we had any other option," she said. "You know we wouldn't ask. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think honesty matters more than making myself look wise or composed. I did not feel noble. I did not feel like the bigger person rising above old wounds. I felt a flash of something so sharp and so ugly it scared me, a kind of vindictive satisfaction. The small, dark voice that whispered, "Now you know, now you understand what it feels like to watch the exact number of dollars that mattered disappear into someone else's hands." I'm not proud of that flash. I'm telling you about it because I think pretending I didn't feel it would make this story a lie, and I promised myself a long time ago I would stop telling the version of my life that made other people comfortable. "I need to think," I told her, which was true, and also the first time in my entire life I had ever told my mother that her need did not automatically become my obligation. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat on my couch with a glass of water I didn't drink, running numbers in my head out of professional habit, even though this had nothing to do with spreadsheets. I thought about the library computer with the cracked monitor. I thought about $612. I thought about the sentence, "You're the strong one," and how it had followed me through every year since, a low hum underneath every accomplishment, this quiet unfairness that no promotion or paycheck had ever quite managed to drown out. And then I thought about my mother's face at that kitchen table 2 years earlier, the way her eyes had filled when she said, "I don't know if I knew it then." And I thought about the fact that whatever my parents were, they were also getting older. And the house on Maple Court was the only home I'd ever known. Imperfect as that home had been, and somewhere underneath 13 years of resentment, there was still a boy who used to fall asleep to the sound of his father's truck pulling into the driveway and feel, for one uncomplicated second, safe. I want to speak to you directly again here, because I think this is the part of the story where people expect a clean answer, and life rarely gives you one. If you've ever had to decide whether to help the people who hurt you, you know there's no formula for it. Forgiveness and financial rescue are not the same decision, even though people often treat them like they are. You can love someone and still refuse to bankroll a pattern. You can be furious at someone and still not want to watch them lose their home. Both of those things can be true in the same chest at the same time, and figuring out what to actually do with that contradiction is some of the hardest emotional work a person can do. I called my father the next morning before work, standing on my back porch in the cold with my coffee going lukewarm in my hand. I asked him one question before I would even discuss numbers. "Does Caleb know you're asking me for this?" There was a pause. "He knows we're in trouble," my father said. "I don't know that he knows we called you specifically." "I want him at dinner Sunday," I said. "All of us. If we're going to talk about this, we're going to talk about it as a family, not just me and Mom on the phone while he doesn't have to be in the room." I heard my father exhale, the particular sound of a man who has spent his whole life avoiding exactly this kind of conversation. "All right," he said. "Sunday." I drove out to Ashland County that Sunday with a folder on the passenger seat of my car. Inside it were printouts I'd spent 3 nights pulling together, old bank statements from the original account, requested from the credit union that had somehow, miraculously, kept digital records going back that far, a copy of my college acceptance letter, a copy of the loan documents I'd signed at 18, the debt I'd spent 9 years paying off, and a single handwritten page, my own, where I'd tried, in plain language, to lay out exactly what that year had cost me, not just in dollars, but in the 2 years I'd delayed getting my CPA license because I couldn't afford the study materials and the exam fees at the same time as rent, in the apartment I'd shared with 3 roommates my first year out of college because I couldn't afford my own place. And the birthday my mother forgot to call on because Caleb had a work crisis that week and everything else got pushed aside. The way everything always got pushed aside. I wasn't bringing the folder to punish anyone. I want to be clear about that, because there's a version of this story where the documents become a weapon, and that's not the story I want to tell you. I brought the folder because I needed my family, for the first time in 13 years, to actually see the shape of what had happened, instead of the soft, forgiving version everyone had agreed to remember instead. Dinner was at 6. My mother had made pot roast, the smell of it filling the house the second I walked in. And for one disorienting moment, I was 8 years old again. Home from school, everything simple. Caleb was already there when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table, the same table, looking older than I remembered, a little heavier, tired around the eyes in a way that made him look more like our father than I'd ever noticed before. "Hey," he said, standing up. And there was an awkwardness between us. A not-quite hug that turned into a handshake that turned into an actual, brief hug. The kind brothers give each other when they don't know what else to do with their hands. We sat down. My mother served the food with the particular over-attentiveness of someone trying to smooth over tension with gravy. Nobody spoke for the first several minutes except a comment on the food, and I could feel the folder sitting in my bag by the door like it had a pulse. It was my father who finally broke the silence. "I imagine you've got questions," he said to me, setting down his fork. "About the money. About all of it." "I do," I said. "But I don't think they're new questions. I think they're the same ones I've had for 13 years. And I think it's time everyone at this table actually answers them, including Caleb." Caleb's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "Answer what?" "Do you know where my college fund went?" I asked him, direct. No preamble. 13 years of preamble was enough. He set the fork down slowly, looked at our parents, then back at me. "I know some of it went to the dealership thing," he said. "I didn't know it was..." "Ethan, I swear to God, I didn't know it was your money specifically. I thought Mom and Dad just had savings." I believed him. That's the strange part. Sitting there, watching his face, I believed him completely. And it complicated the anger I'd been carrying in a way I wasn't prepared for. It's easier to be angry at a villain than at a person who is also, in his own way, a kid being used as a reason. "It wasn't savings," I said. "It was an account with my name on it. Grandma Ruth's inheritance, plus everything Mom and Dad added over 11 years. $41,000. And it existed specifically so I could go to college without drowning myself in debt. When I checked it 3 weeks before graduation, there was $612 left." The table went silent in a way that felt different from every other silence that house had ever held. My mother's eyes were on her plate. My father's jaw was tight. And Caleb looked like someone had opened a door he hadn't known was in the room, revealing a hallway he'd never walked down. "I didn't know that," he said quietly. "Nobody ever told me that." "I know," I said. "That's kind of the point. Nobody told either of us the truth. They just told us different, comfortable versions of it." I reached into my bag then and pulled out the folder, set it on the table between the pot roast and the green beans, an object that suddenly felt heavier than its actual weight. "I'm not doing this to humiliate anyone," I said, looking at my mother, then my father. "I brought this because I needed you to see it, not just remember it the way it's easier to remember it. This is what was taken. This is what it cost. And now you're asking me to hand over the same amount again for a different version of the same mistake, and I need all of us to be honest about what we're actually asking here before I make a decision." My father opened the folder. I watched him read the old account statement, watched something move across his face. Not quite shock, because some part of him had always known, but something like the specific pain of seeing a number made undeniable. My mother didn't open it. She didn't need to. She'd been in that kitchen 13 years ago. She already knew every figure by heart, whether she'd let herself think about them or not. "Ethan," my father said, and his voice had a rawness in it I'd almost never heard from him, not even at his own father's funeral. "I don't have a good excuse. I thought I was helping your brother the way I wished someone had helped me when I was young and scared and in over my head. I told myself I'd fix it before it cost you anything. I was wrong, and I let myself stay wrong for a long time because looking at it honestly was harder than not looking at it at all. It wasn't the apology I'd fantasized about at 18. It didn't erase 13 years in a single sentence, the way apologies do in movies, but it was the first time my father had ever said, plainly, without a defense attached to it, I was wrong. And something in my chest, some fist I'd been carrying since a library computer with a cracked monitor, loosened, just slightly, for the first time in a very long while. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that surprised me more than anything else that night. I want to pay you back, he said. Not Mom and Dad. You. Whatever I can, however long it takes. I know that doesn't undo anything, but I'm not going to sit here and let you carry this like it's just between you and them. I benefited from it. I should be part of fixing it. I didn't answer right away. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, in a way I don't think I had in years. Not as the golden child, not as the reason for every unfairness I'd cataloged since childhood, but as a person who had also, in his own way, been shaped and warped by the same broken system of love our parents had built without meaning to. He hadn't asked to be premature. He hadn't asked to become the family's fragile thing that needed protecting at any cost. He'd just grown up inside that role the way I'd grown up inside mine. And neither of us had chosen the roles, only learned to survive them. I don't need you to pay me back, I said finally. I need you to actually see what happened. That's worth more to me than the money at this point. I want to pause the story here, because I know some of you watching this are waiting for the moment I hand over a check and everyone hugs and the music swells. That's not what happened, and I think that's important, because life doesn't usually give you the clean version. I did not give my parents $40,000 that night. I told them, sitting at that table, that I would not be paying off the second mortgage. I told them the reason wasn't punishment. It was that handing over that exact amount, replacing the exact debt with an exact identical sum, would feel like closing a loop that was never supposed to close that way. I wasn't willing to become the family's emergency fund twice, especially not without any real conversation about how we'd gotten here a second time. What I offered instead was smaller, and I think, in the end, more honest. I offered to sit down with a financial counselor alongside my parents, free of charge, using my own professional knowledge, and go through every option available to them. A loan modification, a hardship program through the mortgage servicer, a possible reverse mortgage given their age, even the hard conversation about whether keeping a house that size, with a payment that size, made sense for two people in their 60s living on a fixed income. I told them I would help them navigate the process, help them understand the paperwork, sit with them through the phone. Calls with the bank that I knew from experience were exhausting and confusing and designed to make you give up. But I would not be writing a check that erased the consequence, because consequences I'd come to believe over 13 years were sometimes the only teacher a family had left. My mother cried at that, not the manipulative kind of crying I might have expected from an earlier version of this story, and not the kind of crying that tried to guilt me into changing my answer. Just quiet, exhausted tears. The kind that come when someone finally understands they're not going to be rescued the easy way, and has to sit with what that means. That's fair, she said after a while, wiping her face with the back of her hand. That's more than fair, actually. We spent the next 3 hours at that table, dinner long gone cold, the pot roast congealing in its own juices, nobody caring, going through what my parents actually owed, what options existed, what Caleb could realistically contribute given his own financial situation, which, it turned out, was far more precarious than any of us had understood, because Caleb, like our parents, had also learned the family habit of hiding the full truth behind a manageable version of it. I found out that night that Caleb had been quietly working 2 jobs for the past 8 months trying to pay down what remained of his own debt from the restaurant, that he'd sold his truck and was driving a car he'd borrowed from a friend, that he hadn't told our parents any of this because he didn't want them to. feel worse than they already did. My brother, it turned out, was not the entitled golden child I'd spent 13 years resenting in the abstract. He was a 34-year-old man drowning quietly in the same undertow that had almost taken me, just wearing a different life jacket, one made of favoritism instead of neglect. But a life jacket that had, in its own way, failed to actually keep him afloat. I left my parents' house that night a little after 10, and I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time before I turned the key, the same way I had after graduation all those years ago. But it was a different silence this time. Not cold, not final, just full of 13 years of things finally spoken instead of buried. The months that followed weren't a fairy tale. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think the honest version is more useful than the tidy one. My parents did end up losing part of the property, not the house itself, but 2 acres of land my father had always talked about leaving to Caleb and me someday, sold to a neighbor to bring the mortgage current and buy some breathing room. My father took it hard. There's a particular kind of grief in watching a man lose something he'd built his whole identity around providing, and I won't pretend it didn't hurt to witness, even after everything. Caleb got a second job doing weekend deliveries on top of his sales position and started sending me $200 a month, without fail, into an account I opened specifically for it, not because I needed the money at that point in my life, but because he needed to be the kind of man who followed through on what he said he'd do. And I understood somewhere in that process that letting him do it was its own kind of gift I could give him. Some months it was less than 200. A few months when things were tight for him, it was nothing at all, and he'd call and tell me, honestly, instead of disappearing, the way our family used to do with hard truths. I came to respect those honest zeros more than I would have respected a silent, dishonest 200. My relationship with my mother slowly became something I hadn't had since childhood. Not perfect, not without its old scar tissue aching in certain weather, but real. She started calling just to talk, not just to ask for something. She asked me questions about my life that weren't wrapped around a favor. She came to visit my townhouse for the first time 18 months after that dinner, stood in my living room the way I had the day I got the keys, ran her hand along the same wall, and said quietly, "You built a good life, Ethan, all on your own." I don't think we ever told you how much that means. I didn't cry in front of her. I want to say I did for the sake of a better story, but the truth is I just nodded and said thank you, and let the moment be smaller than it felt, because some feelings are too big to perform, and that one was mine to keep. My father and I are still working on it. Some wounds close slower between fathers and sons, I think, because men in his generation were never given the language for this kind of repair. But last winter when I drove out for Christmas, he handed me an envelope before I left, no explanation, and told me not to open it until I got home. Inside was $800 in cash and a note, in his handwriting that read, "This isn't the $40,000. I know it's not. It's what I could put together this year without your mother. Finding out and worrying about the budget. I'm going to keep doing this every year I'm able. I should have protected what was yours a long time ago. I'm trying to protect it now, even though I know it's late." I keep that note in a drawer in my desk. Not the money. I put the money into a savings account for a future I haven't fully decided on yet, but the note, because it wasn't an apology dressed up as a gift. It was a promise, kept imperfectly, the only kind my father had ever really known how to make. I think about that library computer sometimes still, more than a decade later. The cracked monitor, the number that didn't fix itself no matter how many times I refreshed the page. I used to think that moment was the worst thing that ever happened to me. I don't think that anymore. I think it was the moment I learned, far too young, that nobody was coming to save me, and that I would have to build my own floor before I could build anything on top of it. If you've ever had to become your own safety net because the people who were supposed to be it chose someone else, I want you to hear this clearly. That strength you built out of necessity is real, and it's yours, and no one can take it from you the way they took everything else. But I also want you to hear the second half of that truth. The part that took me 13 years to learn. Being strong enough to survive without help doesn't mean you should have had to. You were allowed to need things. You are still allowed to need things. Strength was never supposed to be the price of being loved. My parents didn't get to keep every acre of that property. Caleb is still paying off debts that will probably follow him for years. I never did get my $41,000 back. Not really, not in the form it was taken in. And I've made peace with the fact that I probably never will. Because some debts are meant to be repaid in the same currency they were stolen in. What I got instead was smaller, and I've come to believe worth more. I got a family that finally stopped pretending. I got a brother who calls me now, not just when things are falling apart, but sometimes just to talk about nothing, the way brothers are supposed to. I got a mother who asks about my life instead of my wallet. I got a father who is trying, slowly, imperfectly, in cash-filled envelopes and handwritten notes, to be a different kind of man than the one who once told an 18-year-old boy that his strength made him easy to overlook. I didn't save my parents' house the way they asked me to. That Tuesday in March, I saved something else instead, the truth. Finally spoken out loud after 13 years of comfortable silence, and a family that had to fall apart a little further before it could actually start being honest. That, I've come to believe, is its own kind of rescue. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind, where a check gets written and the music swells and everyone hugs in the rain. The quiet kind. The kind that costs you something real and gives you back something realer. If there's one thing I'd want you to carry with you from my story, it's this. You don't owe anyone your rescue just because they once had the power to shape your childhood. Love and money are not the same debt, and you're allowed to offer one without handing over the other. But if you ever do choose to help the people who hurt you, and someday you might do it with your eyes open, with the truth on the table, and with boundaries strong enough that helping them doesn't mean erasing what happened to you. I used to think the opposite of bitterness was forgetting. I don't think that anymore. I think the opposite of bitterness is remembering everything, clearly, honestly, and choosing anyway, to build something better than what was built for you. That's what I did. It took 13 years, one folder of old bank statements, and one very cold pot roast. But I got there. And for the first time in my life, when I think about my family now, I don't think about what was taken from me. I think about what we're building back, one honest conversation at a time.